Hey everyone, today we are looking into Liane de Pougy, an infamous dancer and courtesan in Paris during the late 19th and early 20th century. But in 1910, she gave it all up and married a prince. Luckily for us, she subsequently wrote a memoir entitled My Blue Notebooks, which provides a fascinating account of Paris during the Belle Epoque. This is her story. The woman who had become known as Liane de Pougy was actually born as Anne-Marie Chassaigne in the town of La Flèche in the Sarthe region of France, to the west of Paris on the 2nd of July 1869. Her father was Pierre Blaise Chassaigne, a middle-class Frenchman and a devout Roman Catholic, while her mother was Aimée Lopez, of French-Spanish background, thus making Anne-Marie one quarter Spanish. Young Anne-Marie was educated in keeping with her father's religious sensibilities in a local nunnery, but the overt Christian morality the nuns tried to inculcate into her evidently didn't go very far. When she was just 16 years of age, she eloped from home with a naval officer by the name of Joseph Armand Pourpe, a naval officer by whom she had already fallen pregnant. A son named Marc was soon afterwards born, and the couple were married. The next years were difficult. Anne-Marie not only considered herself to be a bad mother, but her husband was a violent man. He forced himself upon her on their wedding night, and engaged in persistent domestic abuse, which left her with scars which were still visible years later. After she took a lover, it wasn't long until this infidelity was discovered by her controlling husband. After this, he shot her in the wrist. Soon after, she decided to abruptly leave her husband. Like so many others during this period of rampant urban growth, she decided to seek her fortune in the city, and so she headed to Paris. Liane arrived to an incredibly vibrant city. This was the period of French society which is generally known as the Belle Epoque, meaning the beautiful epoch in France. Lasting roughly from the period of the end of the Franco-Prussian War in 1871, and with it the commencement of the Third French Republic, through to the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. The Belle Epoque is typically understood as a period when the economy of France, like that of Europe and North America as a whole, boomed on the back of the first wave of globalization. Technological progress and scientific discovery defined the age, and an optimistic and vibrant cultural output was seen in many European countries. Paris at this time was understood to be the cultural capital of the world, in the same way which New York City would be considered the epicenter of American cultural life in the 20th century. Many of the world's foremost writers, painters, and poets lived or visited here at some point during the 40 or so years of the period, from Victor Hugo and Marcel Proust to Oscar Wilde and Émile Zola. Moreover, the city, with the construction of landmark sites such as the Eiffel Tower and Sacré-Cœur, and the holding of the World's Fair in 1889, developed many of the hallmarks which make it the city it is known as today. Much of Paris's culture at the time revolved around its cafes, restaurants, and also its music halls, casinos, and cabaret establishments. The latter included the famed Moulin Rouge and the Folies Bergere. It was to the latter which Liane found herself drawn in the 1890s, when she arrived in the city. It is not precisely clear when she first started working here as a dancer, as she may have been a bookkeeper for the establishment before taking to the stage. But she had begun to dabble in heavy drug use in the late 1880s, including cocaine and opium, following her escape from her husband, and had also engaged in prostitution to pay her way in the early days in Paris. The Folies Bergere was a cabaret music hall on Rue Richer, in the 9th arrondissement, which had originally been built as an opera house in 1869, but which transitioned to become the Folies Bergere in 1872. It was at the height of its fame as a cabaret hall from the 1890s onwards, right around the time that Liane became involved here. This was owing to the influence of its longtime artistic director Edouard Marchand, who in 1886 had invented a new style of show which was pioneered at the Folies Bergere. Termed the musical revue, it involved performers, usually women, undertaking a mix of performances involving music, dance and sketches. It was here that Liane would become famous for her work in such revues. After she began working in the Folies Bergere, Liane soon became one of its principal stars. The woman who had been christened as Anne-Marie adopted the stage name Liane de Pougy at this point, a name which appears to have been taken in part from one of the long string of lovers which she had in the 1890s and 1900s, the Vicomte de Pougy. By the end of the 1890s, she was known throughout Paris and beyond. Pictures of her adorned postcards could be bought in the city, and writers and dramatists included reference to her in various ways, though often obliquely and without using her name. Despite the fame, it was not a life without its own difficulties. Her own writings deal with themes surrounding the humiliation and violence which could be experienced by both sex workers and those working in more salacious forms of entertainment in the French capital at the turn of the century. A novel of hers from around this time also depicts a cabaret performer who rises swiftly to fame in the great city, but is plagued in private by insecurities and self-doubt. Unsurprisingly, it is understood to have been broadly autobiographical. Liane was far from the only Parisian dancer who acquired a minor celebrity in Belle Epoque France. A contemporary of hers, Jeanne Avril, who was born as Jeanne-Louise Baudon, joined the Moulin Rouge in 1889 and gained notoriety there, before being made famous through a series of paintings of her by the acclaimed French artist Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec. Similarly, Louise Weber, better known by her stage name La Goulou or the Gourmande, was a member of the Moulin Rouge and was one of the highest paid entertainers in Paris during the 1880s and 1890s. Yet, what perhaps distinguishes Liane from many of these other acclaimed dancers was her intellectual depth. She was extremely well read and was able to hold court with many of the most celebrated writers and artists of the day. From the late 1890s, she began writing herself, and novels soon followed. The first two entitled The Elusive One and Mirehil, or The Lesser Portion, appeared in print in quick succession in 1898 and 1899. They depict the lives of Parisian courtesans and dancers such as herself, but also offered complex portraits of Belle Epoque Paris and the social problems which underlay the city's life. Further works in the 1900s even challenged the thinking of some of the leading literary figures of the early 20th century. Moreover, additional works are attributed to her, including a play and a collection of short stories, highlighting the breadth of her literary output. No courtesan or dancer can continue in their trade interminably. Liane decided to call it quits in 1910, shortly after her 40th birthday. She had a string of lovers over the previous 15 years, both men and women. Some of these were well-known figures such as the American expatriate, playwright, poet and novelist Natalie Clifford Barney, who subsequently ran a famed literary salon on the left bank of the Seine throughout much of the first half of the 20th century. There is substantial evidence to suggest that Liane considered Barney to be the love of her life. However, it was with a prince that Liane would eventually settle down. On the 8th of June 1910, she married Prince Georges Guica, a man whom she once described as too handsome. Georges was a prominent member of the Guica or Gica family, a noble dynasty which had held a prominent position in the province of Wallachia, in the northeast of the Balkans, in what are now parts of Moldova and Romania, between the 17th and 19th centuries. The marriage would last for much of the remainder of Liane's long life, despite Prince George temporarily eloping with a younger woman in the late 1920s, a decision which he soon regretted, and he returned to Liane about a year later. They did not have any children, though Liane had re-established a relationship with her son from her first marriage, Marc Pourpe. Tragedy, however, struck in the mid-1910s. Marc was a pioneer in the booming field of aviation. While in Egypt in 1914, he had made the first official airmail flight by flying 1,250 miles from Cairo to Khartoum, in what is now Sudan, in just 8 days. When the First World War broke out later that year, Marc joined the nascent French air services as a bomber pilot, but he was killed just weeks later in early December 1914 when he was shot down on a reconnaissance mission over the Somme in northern France. Thus, Liane lost her only child. Liane subsequently turned to religion for consolation. Her long years of marriage were spent in various endeavours, notably charitable work. She became heavily involved in the work of an asylum for children who had been born with birth defects. Liane patronised the institution and drew numerous wealthy benefactors into supporting it, notably the famed French fashion designer Coco Chanel. However, her later life is probably most remarkable for the production of her most well-known publication. Between 1919 and 1941, she composed an extended memoir of her life in Paris, which was eventually published as My Blue Notebooks. This provides a fascinating insight into the society of Belle Epoque Paris, and some of the most famed literary, artistic and even political figures of the age. De Pougy describes hosting the famed poet, novelist and playwright Jean Cocteau and the poet Max Jacob at the Folies Bergere, and her sadness at the death of Marcel Proust, whom she describes as having been an acquaintance of hers years earlier in Paris. Elsewhere, she critiques the work of Colette, the French mime, actress and journalist, who became well known years later for writing Gigi. Overall, My Blue Notebooks provides a fascinating insight into the rich society of Paris at a time when the French capital was a cultural epicenter of the entire world. It is a testament to the culture of the Belle Epoque. Princess Liane and Prince Georges moved to Lausanne, a large town in western Switzerland, following the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939. France was soon to be invaded by the Germans, and as a neutral country, with no particular value to the Nazi state, Switzerland would avoid involvement in the war almost entirely. When Georges died in the 1940s, Liane's revitalized religious sensibilities were again on display. She became a tertiary or lay member of the Order of Saint-Dominique as Sister Anne-Marie. She would die in Lausanne on the 26th of December 1950 in her early 80s, and was buried in the nunnery of the Saint Agnes Asylum in Grenoble in eastern France. Thank you so much everyone for watching this video on Liane de Pougy. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, be sure to leave me a like and a comment down below. And if you're new, why not subscribe? If you have any suggestions, be sure to leave them in the comments, or there are links to my Instagram and my email in the description. Anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.